Ladies and gentlemen, there are moments in life when words are not enough, when silence says more than any carefully constructed sentence ever could. Tonight is one of those moments. This is not just an announcement, it is a turning point. A place where years of hope, work, and sacrifice finally meet the unshakable truth of time. This is where it ends, and maybe where something even greater begins. For most of my life, I've tried to build things that stretch beyond the horizon of what we think is possible. Machines that outlive their creators, ideas that don't just inspire, but outlast. But no matter how far technology evolves, no matter how bright our cities glow at night, there is one reality we can never outrun: we are human. Fragile, finite, and astonishingly temporary. And it is in that temporary nature where the greatest truths hide. I remember standing in a cold lab one night, staring at neural data flowing across a screen. Lines, spikes, electrical storms, beautiful chaos wrapped in fragile biological code. It was then that I realized something both magnificent and devastating: every thought, every dream, every heartbeat is temporary. Not because we are weak, but because we are alive, and life, in all its brilliance, has an end. When people talk about innovation, they often speak in terms of immortality, cures, breakthroughs, escape plans. But the truth is, innovation is not a way to escape mortality. It's a way to understand it more deeply, to dance with it rather than deny it. And in this moment, as I stand before you, that dance feels more personal than it ever has. For years, I've carried a quiet truth that very few people knew. Behind every invention, every mission, every night of restless thought, there was a voice, a presence, whispering in the spaces between ambition and exhaustion. It wasn't a colleague or a friend. It was the weight of impermanence itself. It followed me through the corridors of research facilities, across the deserts where rockets touched the sky, and even in the silence of sleepless nights, when the world had fallen away and only raw thought remained. You see, most people assume science is about control, about mastering the unknown. But those who work at the edge of knowledge know the opposite is true. Science is about humility. It's about acknowledging how little we truly grasp and how precious each moment is. Every neural connection that fires, every heartbeat that sustains consciousness, is a miracle balanced on the edge of entropy. I have spent years studying not just machines, but the human brain, this extraordinary, intricate network of billions of neurons firing in symphonies too complex for language. We often think of the brain as the seat of identity, the thing that makes us us. But beneath its brilliance, it is still a fragile organ, as vulnerable as it is powerful. One moment it creates entire universes of thought, the next it can collapse into silence. That silence is the end. I've watched brilliant minds, people whose intelligence shaped entire industries, slowly lose their memories. I've held their hands as they searched for names they once spoke every day. I've seen the spark in their eyes fade like a dying star, and in those moments no equation, no machine, no wealth could stop what was coming. That is what makes this moment real. When I say this is where it ends, I'm not just speaking about a project, or a company, or even a dream. I am speaking about the quiet inevitability that binds us all together. The moment where every innovation, every ambition, every heartbeat, every thought eventually lets go. And yet, even in that inevitability, there is a strange and beautiful kind of hope. There is a phenomenon in neuroscience that I've always found extraordinary. When the brain approaches its limits, when life is slipping away, it doesn't always shut down in despair. Often, it releases a flood of neural patterns, a final symphony. Some describe it as clarity, others as peace. For some, it's the moment when they feel a presence beyond themselves, something larger, quieter, infinite. And that, perhaps, is the greatest gift evolution ever gave us: a soft landing into the unknown. This is not a surrender. This is a recognition. For too long, humanity has treated mortality like an enemy, a problem to be solved, a bug in the system. But what if it's not a bug? What if it's the most elegant piece of the code? What if endings are not failures, but the way the universe reminds us that everything beautiful is rare and fleeting? I used to think the ultimate goal was to outlast time, to build machines that never die, to create systems that don't age, to stretch existence into infinity. But over the years, I've learned something far more profound. The value of something isn't in how long it lasts, but in the intensity with which it exists. A star that burns bright for a brief moment can illuminate entire worlds. A single act of love, a single spark of courage, can ripple through centuries. That is what makes endings meaningful. They give weight to the moments that came before. I remember the first time I watched a launch knowing it might be my last. I wasn't afraid of failure. I wasn't even afraid of death. I was afraid of leaving behind something unfinished. But then I realized, nothing is ever truly unfinished. Everything we build becomes part of a larger story. Someone picks it up. Someone carries it forward. It continues, not because we held on forever, but because we dared to begin. In the end, the human brain isn't just an organ. It's a storyteller. It takes fragmented bits of reality and turns them into meaning. It builds worlds not out of matter, but out of purpose. And when that story reaches its final page, something remarkable happens. It doesn't vanish. It echoes. It becomes the foundation of the next story. Tonight is not about loss. It is about transition. It is about looking into the mirror of time and realizing that even the greatest journeys have a sunset. And that sunset is not a sign of failure. It's a sign that you lived, that you dared, that you mattered. Some of you may wonder why this announcement feels so personal. It's because it is. I've given everything I have to this vision, to the pursuit of something beyond myself. And now, I must give it what I've never given before, an ending. But endings, like all natural things, can be beautiful if we allow them to be. I've spent years studying the mind, but the most profound lesson didn't come from a lab or a data set. It came from a hospital room. A man lay there, frail, unrecognizable from the genius he once was. His mind was fading, slipping between clarity and silence. But in one brief moment, he looked at me, not through me, but into me, and whispered, "Everything ends. That's why it matters." Those words embedded themselves into the architecture of my own thoughts. They became the quiet anchor behind every decision that followed. We spend so much of our lives chasing more time, more power, more certainty. But maybe the real strength lies not in defying the end, but in facing it with unshakable clarity. When a neuron fires for the last time, it does not mourn. It simply completes its journey. When a star collapses, it gives birth to something new. When a story ends, it leaves space for another to begin. And that is where hope lives, not in immortality, but in legacy. This is where it ends, not in darkness, but in light. Not in silence, but in resonance. And as we stand on this threshold together, I want you to understand something very clearly. This ending is not about loss. It is about giving the future a clean sky to build upon. I've spent years trying to design systems that outlive me. But what truly outlives a person is not what they build with their hands, but what they ignite in the minds of others. That is the one thing time can never erase. There's an image I can't shake from my mind. It's of a neuron, a single neuron, firing in the dark. It knows nothing of the larger brain, the person, the world. And yet, in that moment, it contributes to a thought, a feeling, a memory. It's a tiny part of something immeasurably larger. We are all that neuron. Small, temporary, but part of something vast. And when our spark fades, the system continues. The story continues. Life continues. So tonight, as I say goodbye, not to everything, but to this chapter, I want you to remember this: endings are not the enemy. Fear is. Fear tells us to cling. Fear tells us to deny. But courage tells us to let go with grace, with purpose, with love. I stand here not as someone defeated by time, but as someone finally at peace with it. There is no technology that can rewrite this part of the story. There is only the choice to face it with open eyes and an open heart. And that choice, this moment, is where the story begins to transcend the storyteller. When I look back at the long, winding path that brought me here, I see more than achievements and failures. I see faces. I see hands that reached out in moments of uncertainty, voices that steadied me when the world felt like it was tilting. For all the talk of technology and ambition, the truth is, the real architecture of our lives is built in moments of human connection. I remember walking through the quiet halls of a research lab late one night. Everyone had gone home. The lights were dim, the machines were silent, except for the steady hum of an old monitor. On that screen was a simulation, a map of neural pathways lighting up like constellations. It struck me in that moment everything I'd ever done, everything I'd ever dreamed, was built on this miracle inside our heads. Billions of neurons, each with its own rhythm, communicating in silence, holding together the fragile illusion we call identity. The human brain doesn't shout, it whispers. It speaks in electrical pulses and chemical waves, in a language older than any civilization. And for a few decades, if we are lucky, we get to hear that whisper. Then, eventually, it grows quiet. That quiet is not a tragedy. It is nature completing its cycle. But as much as science can explain this, it does not erase the H of it. Standing at the edge of something so final forces us to ask the hardest questions. Did I do enough? Did I love enough? Did I matter? Those questions are not answered in data. They are answered in the quiet spaces between people, in the echoes of the lives we've touched. There was a time when I believed that if I worked hard enough, built fast enough, and dreamed big enough, I could outrun those questions. But you can't. None of us can. The end finds us all not with fury, but with a whisper. And in that whisper, it asks for honesty. One of the most profound experiences I've ever had was watching a patient in the final stages of cognitive decline. This was a man who had once been a towering figure in science, a mentor, someone whose mind shaped the way I thought about the world. In the last weeks, his speech faded, his memories scattered like leaves in a storm. But one day, just before the silence took him entirely, he looked at me and smiled. It wasn't a smile of recognition. It was something deeper, a knowing, a quiet acceptance that didn't need words. That moment taught me more about the brain than a lifetime of research ever could. We think of memory as something we own, but it's more like something we borrow. For a while it belongs to us. Then it drifts back into the larger fabric of existence. That's why it matters so deeply what we do while it's still ours. That's why endings, as painful as they are, carry a sacred weight. People often ask me why I push so hard to create, to innovate, to reach for the impossible. And the truth is, it was never just about machines or discoveries. It was about the fear of that quiet, that soft, unstoppable tide of time. I thought if I could build fast enough, maybe I could hold it back. But now I see the truth. The quiet isn't the enemy, it's the destination. There's a point in neuroscience when the patterns that define us begin to dissolve. Not abruptly, but gently. It's like a painting submerged in water. Slowly, the sharp lines blur, the colors mix, and what remains is something softer, almost transcendent. Some people call it fading. I call it becoming part of everything else. We spend so much of our lives trying to make our mark on the world, but maybe the greatest legacy isn't the mark we leave, but the way we return to it. Just as a wave returns to the ocean, we return to the fabric that created us. Not gone, just changed. Tonight, I am not standing here as someone who has conquered anything. I am standing here as someone who has learned to let go, to understand that even the brightest flames must dim, not as a tragedy, but as a gift. Because without that dimming, there would be no stars, no contrast, no meaning. I once had a conversation with a child, someone who had no idea about science or mortality, but understood life better than most adults. They asked me, "Why are stars so beautiful if they die?" I didn't have an answer then, but now I do. Stars are beautiful because they die, because they remind us that brilliance is not meant to last forever. It is meant to be seen, felt, remembered, and then passed on. When I say this is where it ends, I'm not closing a door. I'm acknowledging that some doors are not meant to stay open forever. And in that closing, there is dignity. There is truth. There is an invitation for others to step forward, to continue the work, to tell the next part of the story. There's a neural principle I've always found fascinating: synaptic pruning. It's the brain's way of letting go of connections that no longer serve its growth, so that stronger, more essential ones can thrive. That's what this moment feels like. A pruning, not an erasure, but a refinement. A passing of energy from one phase to another. I've spent years trying to understand consciousness. What makes a person who they are? What is the self really? Every time I thought I'd found an answer, the universe handed me a deeper question. But as the years went on, I started to see a pattern. Consciousness isn't something we own, it's something we participate in. It moves through us like wind through the trees. For a moment, it bends to our shape, our story. Then it moves on. And that's why this moment is not a tragedy. It's a continuation of the oldest story ever told, the story of change. Everything we are, every thought, every breath, every heartbeat, is part of a vast and ancient rhythm. We arrive, we build, we love, we let go. When I was younger, I feared that letting go meant being forgotten. But I've learned that what matters most isn't being remembered by name. It's being remembered through impact, through the lives touched, the ideas sparked, the hope left behind. The most powerful forces in the universe are often the ones that leave no trace of themselves, but set everything in motion. I've stood at the edge of rockets as they tore through the night sky. I've listened to machines hum in perfect harmony, but none of those moments compare to the quiet heartbeat of a human being who knows their time is finite and chooses to live anyway. That is where real power lies, not in defying the end, but in embracing it with courage. There's a phrase I've often repeated to myself in difficult times. Entropy is not the enemy. It sounds almost cold at first, but the more I lived with it, the more I understood it. Entropy is what allows new stars to be born. It's what gives rise to life, to change, to everything that ever was or will be. Without endings, there would be no beginnings. And so, as I step back, as I allow the next wave to rise, I feel something unexpected, not fear but calm. This is the rhythm of things, the pulse of existence, and it's beautiful in its honesty. There is a kind of silence that isn't empty. It's full of everything that came before, full of the lives that intersected, the hands that built, the minds that dreamed. That's the silence I'm stepping into. Not darkness, not absence, presence of a different kind. I want to tell you something personal, something I've never said out loud before. For years, I thought strength meant never showing the weight I carried, but tonight I will. Because real strength isn't in pretending to be invincible. It's in standing in front of the world and saying, "This is where it ends," and not looking away. I can feel the world moving beneath me. Not in the way rockets shake the ground, but in the subtle, quiet way time moves everything forward. It's relentless, but it's fair. It gives each of us a moment, a spark, to exist. What we do with that spark is everything. So, if there's anything I want you to take from this night, from these words, from this ending, it's this: live while you burn. Build while you breathe. Love while the neurons still fire. Don't wait for more time. Don't wait for perfect certainty. Perfection is a myth. But presence is real. I've seen minds fall apart. I've seen bodies fail. I've seen dreams unravel. But I've also seen people rise in the face of all of it. Not because they were fearless, but because they loved something enough to keep going. As this chapter closes, I don't want you to remember the machines or the numbers or even the speeches. Remember the heartbeat behind it all, the fragile, beautiful, temporary pulse that said, "I was here, I tried, I loved," and that was enough. I have always believed that beneath every great achievement lies a simple question: why? Why build? Why dream? Why keep reaching when everything eventually ends? For a long time, my answer was survival. I thought if we could expand far enough, build strong enough, automate deeply enough, maybe we could outlast the inevitable. But the truth I've come to face is more delicate, more human. The purpose was never to escape endings. The purpose was to give the time we have its fullest meaning. There's a quiet kind of wisdom that only comes when you stop fighting the horizon. It's the wisdom of old stars, of fading neurons, of the final heartbeat before silence. It whispers, You were never meant to stay. You were meant to shine while you could. And that, more than any machine, any mission, any empire, is what matters. As a neuroscientist, I've spent years trying to understand what makes a human life meaningful at the edge of its end. I've sat beside people as their memories faded into the void, and I've listened to the last words of those who once thought they'd have decades more. And what's striking isn't how different their stories are, but how similar. They don't speak of money. They don't speak of titles. They speak of faces, of hands they held, of quiet nights, of laughter that echoed longer than they expected. In the end, meaning is not written in grand gestures. It's written in moments so small they often go unnoticed until they're gone. I remember a night when I stood alone on a launch pad after everyone had left. The air was still. The metal around me carried the memory of fire. Above me, the sky stretched endlessly, black, silent, infinite. I felt both immeasurably small and inexplicably connected to everything. That moment became a kind of anchor in my mind. Because I understood, finally, that I wasn't building to last forever. I was building to belong to something larger. When we stand at the edge of something ending, the temptation is to look back at what we've lost. But what if, instead, we looked at what we've given? Every idea, every gesture, every act of courage leaves a fingerprint on the fabric of existence. You may never see the full shape of what you've changed, but it's there, echoing through lives you'll never meet. That is the quiet immortality that science cannot build but life naturally grants. I've often wondered what the brain experiences in its final seconds. We've recorded patterns, observed bursts of activity, watched that last surge of electrical fire. It's as if the mind, in its last breath, gives everything it has, one last crescendo before the silence. I think about that often, because maybe that's what we're meant to do too, to live like that final surge, to give everything we can before the lights dim. There's a line from a study that never left me. It described the moment consciousness begins to dissolve as a return to undifferentiated light. Cold, clinical language for something profoundly poetic. It made me realize endings don't erase us. They return us to the sky, to the soil, to the story, to everything. I want you to imagine for a moment a single spark traveling through a dark forest. It's small, insignificant maybe, but as it moves, it touches others. A single neuron fires, then another, then another. Before long, the forest is alive with light. That's what a life does. Even when it ends, the light keeps moving. That's why I'm standing here tonight, not in mourning, but in reverence. Reverence for the finite, reverence for the heartbeat, reverence for the way things must end to make way for what's next. You see, I've made peace with the idea that my story is only a chapter, and that's not just acceptable, it's beautiful, because no chapter should last forever. If it did, no other stories could begin. As I prepared for this moment, I found myself revisiting memories I thought I'd buried. The early failures, the impossible nights, the quiet victories no one ever saw. At first, I thought I was reliving them out of fear of letting go. But I realize now I wasn't clinging, I was honoring. Honoring every neuron that fired to make those moments real. Honoring the people who stood beside me in the dark. Honoring the weight and the wonder of simply being alive. That is the gift of an ending. It makes everything that came before it shine just a little brighter. I've spent a lifetime trying to understand the human mind, but it's in these final steps of a journey that I've come to understand the human heart. The mind builds, calculates, explores. The heart remembers. It holds everything quietly, gently, until it's time to let go. And that's what I'm doing now. Letting go, not with regret, but with gratitude. Some of you will carry forward the work that's been done. Some of you will build new things entirely. Some of you will look back at this night and remember only fragments, a sentence, a feeling, maybe just the way the air felt in the room. But whatever stays, let it be this: endings are not the absence of meaning. They are the proof that meaning was real. We live in an age where people fear silence more than anything. We fill every gap with noise, every pause with distraction. But silence is not something to fear. It is the most honest thing the universe gives us. It's where everything begins and ends. It's where the mind meets the infinite. I don't know what comes after this, not with certainty. Science can map the decline of neurons, measure the last breath, describe the chemical ballad of the brain shutting down, but it cannot touch the mystery that lies beyond. And maybe that's not a flaw. Maybe that's the most beautiful part of all. What I do know is this: the work will continue. The ideas will breathe through new minds. The spark will pass to new hands. And when it does, it will be more than I could have ever made it on my own. That's the nature of legacy. It doesn't belong to one person. It belongs to everyone it touches. As I look out at you, I don't see an audience. I see carriers of the next story. I see the light moving forward. I see a world that will continue, not because I stayed, but because I dared to build and then dared to let go. In neuroscience, there's a phenomenon called long-term potentiation, a strengthening of synapses that allows memory to persist. Tonight, this is my final firing, my last surge of energy into the network, my last signal. And I trust that it will travel further than I ever could. So when the lights fade and the silence settles, don't mourn. Listen. In that quiet, you'll hear the echoes, not of me, but of everything we've built together. And maybe, just maybe, in some distant corner of the future, someone will feel the warmth of that spark without ever knowing where it came from. That is enough. Ladies and gentlemen, this is where it ends. Not in sorrow, but in light. Not in silence, but in resonance. Not as a failure, but as the most honest moment a life can offer. Thank you for listening, for carrying the story forward, for being the future that I now step aside to make room for. And when the next spark comes, I hope you'll let it burn.